Hello and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new, then welcome. I'm Jess and I hope to earn your subscription today in this video. I'm going to do a little deep dive into one article about one person. So previously in the past, we've done this with other characters that are somewhat affiliated with the JFK assassination. So we did a little series on Ruth Paine that was wonderful. We did just last week a talk about the research that a man named Penn Jones compiled into all the different witnesses that had some part to play in the evidence surrounding the JFK assassination and how they had odd circumstances, questionable mysteries around their deaths. So that was fascinating. If you missed that, go back to it. At some point, I'm really hoping to at least read parts of this book with you all about Jack Ruby, because like Ruth Paine, I get the sense that he is one of those figures that the more that you understand him, the more you begin to understand that the lone gunman theory just doesn't hold water. I'd like to go through that with you all sometime, but today we are going through one article. And the thing about this article is very fascinating. So you can see this is the actual reprint of the article. It is called Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen? And this magazine, they printed this article and it was so popular and has gained such notoriety as something that was needful and important at the time that they've gone ahead and reprinted it in full. But it was printed in Midwest Today and it says copyright 2007. This article is fascinating and it's long. So we are going to do it in 2 episodes, which I will release back to back. So after you watch this episode, you can be on the lookout for the second half of the article in the following episode. This is the article. It's all about a woman named Dorothy Kilgallen. This is her right at the center. And the more that you learn about her, she was a fascinating woman. So a few little smatterings of things that I know about her are that she did this amazing competition that was like a world traveling event. And she was the only woman who participated. And so that's how she initially came to notoriety, was she did this wonderful thing. And we may read about this in this article. She was also a very celebrated journalist and she did hard-hitting interviews. Another thing that she did was she was on the show, What's My Line, where someone would come on and the panelists would have to, through deduction and I believe yes/no questions, figure out what a person did for a living. And so she was one of the top panelists on that show and was just celebrated for kind of her ability to winkle out the facts from the questions that she and the other panelists would ask. And so, yeah, she was a very celebrated, very interesting woman. She had connections to Marilyn Monroe, to the Kennedys, and she was kind of a New York socialite as well. So we are going to read about her. One of the reasons why we will read about her, and I know the interview will get, or the article will get into this, so I'm not going to say a lot about it, except that she was the only person to interview Jack Ruby after he murdered Lee Harvey Oswald in a room that was not bugged. And many people believe that's what led to her death. So let's get into it. It says, Who Killed Dorothy Kilgallen? Born in Chicago, she became a New York journalist and popular game show panelist. But her mysterious death still troubles a legion of fans who won't forget this remarkable woman. The article is by Sarah Jordan. And like I said, it's from a publication called Midwest Today. During her 35-year career as a gossip columnist, crime reporter and panelist on the weekly TV game show What's My Line, Dorothy Kilgallen, who was called Dolly Mae by her friends, was a fearless journalist who broke major stories. She was the only reporter to interview Lee Harvey Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby. Her biggest case yet investigating President John F. Kennedy's assassination and finding fault with the official story, became the last one she ever pursued. She died mysteriously in 1965, November, so 2 years after Kennedy's assassination, after being threatened. But the cops never probed further. Thanks to reruns on the Game Show Network, fans are still talking about Dorothy, including Larry King of CNN and Dominic Dunn, who wrote about her in Vanity Fair. Now, shocking new information has emerged. So this must be written in 2007. This is good to know. Dorothy Mae Kilgallen, who was born in Chicago on July 3rd, 1913, to Mae and James Kilgallen, graduated in 1930 from Erasmus Hall High School. She got her first taste of journalism from her father, who was a highly regarded newspaperman working for Hearst papers in Illinois and Indiana. She would soon follow in his footsteps, becoming a crime reporter at age 17 and attending New Rochelle College for a year. Dorothy was a trendsetter, as crime journalism was considered an unsuitable profession for a woman at the time. In September of 1936, Kilgallen found out that 2 newspapers were sending reporters on a race around the world, and she convinced her editors at the New York Evening Journal to dispatch her as well. Only 23, she had just 2 days to get 16 visas and a passport. She promised her father she would attend Mass en route whenever possible. Dorothy's trip included flights on the Hindenburg and Pan Am's China Clipper. What an adventurer. I like this woman so much. If you don't know, I have a bit of the adventure bug in me as well, which is why I'm like Sporty Spice today, because I am this ridiculous woman who does silly things like planning huge backpacking trips amidst having a YouTube channel and teaching students and doing 75 hard. Anyway, her adventurous spirit inspires me. It took 24 days, and she came in second to a man who cheated by booking charter flights. Interesting, so she would have been first if he hadn't cheated. Still, she became the first woman to fly around the world. Upon her return, every house on her block was decorated with American flags and her picture. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to congratulate her. Kilgallen then published a memoir on her trip. Next, she appeared in the movie Sinner Take All, and the following year she wrote the script to Fly Away Baby. So definitely a Renaissance woman. She is a writer, she is an adventurer, she is adept at getting like administrative things knocked out, and then also can write books. Very fascinating. By November of 1937, Kilgallen was back working for the New York Journal and received her own column entitled Hollywood Scene. In 1938, after her paper merged with another, Dorothy started a new column for the New York Journal American. This one was called The Voice of Broadway. It represented the social elite, the famous people, the ones who ate at the fanciest restaurants, saw the greatest shows, and cocktailed the night away. In 1940, Dorothy married actor Richard Colmar, 3 years her senior, who played Boston Blackie on the radio crime drama. The wedding was attended by 800 guests, including Ethel Merman and Milton Berle. The couple would later have 3 children named Jill, Richard, and Carrie, with a K, like a male Carrie. April of 1945 brought Mr. and Mrs. Colmar their own live radio program, broadcast daily from their home, and called Breakfast with Dorothy and Dick. These are very enterprising people. Can you feel it? Like they're on the cutting edge of the technology of their day. It's just very interesting. By 1950, Dorothy's column was running in 146 papers and garnering 20 million readers. The Kilgallen approach was a mix of catty gossip, like a world-famous movie idol plastered, commanded a pretty girl to get into his limousine, take off all her clothes. Odd tidbits of inconsequential information. The Duke of Windsor eats caviar with a spoon. And dark warnings. Anti-American factions are planning to blow up the Panama Canal. Her deal: bring me 3 detrimental stories concerning other stars, and I will include a good piece about your client, became the way she ran her column. Wow, get all the dirt on everybody. She cruised New York night spots like the Stork Club, Copacabana, Eden Rock, Delmonico's, and the Cotillion Room, picking up tidbits, writing them on matchbooks, and tossing them in her purse. She frequented P.J. Clark's for lunch, occupying the same big round table in the back corner of the room that is still there. And like the eminence grisée, I'm probably not saying that right, it's probably a French term, that she had become, she held court with all kinds of politicos, celebrities, wits, and movie stars paying homage. Reuben's restaurant in New York even named a sandwich after her. The Dorothy Kilgallen was $1.10. That same year, Dorothy became a regular panelist on the new game show What's My Line. She would appear weekly for the next 15 years. The series ran for 17. In Dorothy, viewers saw a highly intelligent woman who was quick-witted, put together, and who seemed to be enjoying herself. Each broadcast, which was seen by 25 million viewers, also featured a celebrity guest, for whom the panelists were blindfolded. The show came out of a time when Hilton meant Conrad, not Paris, so the celebs had more heft. Among the guests were Lucille Ball, Artie Shaw, Bob Hope, Carol Baker, Gloria Swanson, Frank Lloyd Wright, Salvador Dali, Joe DiMaggio, and Liberace. The premise of the show was that contestants with unusual occupations were interviewed by the panelists. Only questions that could be answered with a yes or no were allowed, with the contestant winning $5 per no answer. The game ended either upon 10 no answers, a panelist correctly guessing the player's secret, or at the discretion of the moderator. The viewers at home knew the occupation of each guest from words that were flashed on the screen at the start of the questioning. The show was broadcast live from New York on Sunday nights at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from a drab 7-story theater on 54th Street that was later remodeled into the famed disco Studio 54. What's My Line reruns are aired on the Game Show Network each Sunday night at 2 a.m. The Wall Street Journal called the reruns a bracing antidote to today's dispiriting talkathons, humiliating reality shows, and hostile cable news programs. What strikes you first is the civility. The men wore black tie, the women evening gowns and jewels. While she was having fun on What's My Line, Dorothy Kilgallen became the most famous columnist in America. She often eclipsed the stars that she wrote about. When she attended the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1952, she was there. She wore a silver gown with 14,000 embroidered jewels and pearls that were encrusted at the scalloped neckline. She placed a tiara on her head, put on her white mink cape lined with silver lame, grabbed her Western Union copy paper, and headed off to Westminster Abbey. I was looking to see if we have a photo of that dress, but it does not appear that we do, sadly. We'll have to look that up. That sounds really beautiful. She won a Pulitzer nomination. Dorothy and her family also moved into a 5-story townhouse on Park Avenue. It was an elegant setting with chandeliers, French doors, original art, and furniture out of Gone with the Wind. The Colmars were known for their glittering parties. Dorothy worked and slept in a room on the 5th floor she called the Cloop. It was her sanctuary, and she did not permit anyone else to be around her there. It had chartreuse carpeting, flowered wallpaper, and embroidered organdy curtains tied back with taffeta bows. She told her dad, "I like pretty things," and her father, Jim, smiled when he recalled the room was an index to her character. Even when she was a cub reporter at $20 a week, she was a spender and inclined to extravagance. Her expense accounts were high, and her personal taxi bills exceeded her weekly income. But, her father recalled, she had an unerring instinct for news. She had a brilliant style of writing. She was accurate and had a flair for the apt phrase. She had an uncanny ability to produce scoops and an inordinate speed in turning out copy. Interestingly, this reminds me of a friend of mine. And I was just talking with a mutual friend about her, that when you walk into her home, it's beautiful, it's welcoming. She has everything just so. All the colors like complement one another. And you just get the sense like, man, her house is beautiful. Well, after knowing her for a little while, I learned that her mother was an interior decorator. And so she comes by it more naturally than you or I. I get that same sense here from Dorothy, that her father was a newspaper man. And so it's kind of like the air that she breathed. She understood the turn of phrase. She understood how to turn out copy and how to get a scoop. It came to her almost by osmosis, just by being close to her father. I do think that the more that you watch families where there's some sort of dynasty, I mean, whether it's interior decorating or, presidential families where there's some sort of political power that seems to pass from father to son. Now, sometimes that's just plain old nepotism, but there is also an element of this, that whatever you grow up understanding your parents to do, you hear that kind of conversation, and it becomes part of the makeup of how you view the world and what you bring to the world through your experiences and through your skills. Not everyone, however, was equally enamored with Dorothy. Frank Sinatra carried on a public feud with her, cruelly deriding her in his Las Vegas act as that chinless wonder. How rude is that? Very odd. I mean, she does have a small chin, but what a rude thing to say. She responded by reminding people of his mob ties. Kilgallen was also sued for $700,000 by a female White House reporter to whom Dorothy had referred with a blind item in her column, but did not name. It was a ludicrous suit, which Dorothy won, but it did cause her much anxiety. Over the years, Dorothy covered a series of famous murder cases and was instrumental in helping a man accused of killing his 4-month pregnant wife gain a new trial. His name was Dr. Sam Shepard, and DNA evidence later cleared him. That is what that movie, The Fugitive, is based upon, but she actually was an instrumental part of helping clear his name at the time. Not in the story, not in the, movie version, but in reality. She's such a hero. In 1959 and 60, she wrote anti-Castro articles with first-hand accounts from Cubans living in Miami, so Cuban exiles. In a column which appeared on July 15th, 1959, Kilgallen became the first reporter to imply that the CIA was working with organized crime to knock off Fidel Castro. So 1959, 3 years before Kennedy's assassination, she was talking about the CIA working with organized crime to knock off Fidel Castro. The FBI had been surveilling Dorothy since the 1930s, and now they tried to dig up more dirt on her. An internal memo to Director J. Edgar Hoover, dated September 15, 1959, cited a confidential informant who states that Dorothy and her husband Richard have their own private lives, that he, quote, has been dating other women, is interested in both sexes, and has his own private apartment, end quote. This is just the sort of dirty research that J. Edgar Hoover was doing for all sorts of people, including the principal actors or the principal people who were assassinated in the 60s, JFK, MLK, and RFK. There were threats made, we know, to Martin Luther King Jr. With the information that they collected on him. So this is a decades-long practice of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover to manipulate people and to control them. They were doing it to Dorothy Kilgallen since the 30s. As her husband's attention wandered, Dorothy began a long-term and passionate affair with singer Johnny Ray, 14 years her junior. Ray was a troubled man with a hearing impairment from childhood and a career that was spotty. It's interesting that he was a singer but had a hearing impairment. Those two things would potentially seem to be at odds with one another. Dorothy was head over heels in love with Johnny and flew anywhere to meet him. On August 3rd, 1962, so now we're just a year before the JFK assassination, Kilgallen became the first journalist to refer publicly to Marilyn Monroe's relationship with a Kennedy. That is marked. Within 48 hours, Marilyn Monroe was found dead of a drug overdose at her Los Angeles residence. I didn't realize the proximity, the closeness of those two events, that she published something publicly and less than 2 days later, Marilyn is dead. The inquiry into her death was marred by numerous unanswered questions and contradictions in the medical findings. We have a little note, a footnote in the article. It says, for instance, the extremely high level of Nembutal found in Marilyn Monroe's blood would have required 50 plus capsules to have been swallowed if it had been suicide. And yet no gross pill fragments were found in her stomach, and no microscopic crystal residue in gastric or duodenal fluids. But there was bruising of the colon and small bruises on her posterior hip and lower back. In a book called Double Cross by Sam Giancana, who bears the same name as his grandfather, he claims the Chicago mobster bragged that the mafia had Marilyn killed by forcibly administering an enema containing a massive dose of Nembutal. This would explain the findings of colonic bruising due to the sudden forced distension by the enema, and would also explain some bruising as they held her on her stomach. The alleged motive was to implicate the Kennedys in scandal, since the administration had pursued the mafia. Robert, who was trying to break off an affair with Marilyn, was in LA that day, and a police officer spotted his car in Monroe's neighborhood. A Senate Intelligence Committee inquiry into JFK's death showed that both the mob and the FBI were bugging Marilyn's phone. That's a really helpful footnote, isn't it? With all sorts of fascinating and concerning information. So if you didn't catch all of that, you may just want to skip back 30 seconds or 60 seconds, however long that took, and re-listen to that part, because it is filled with connections and information that helps us understand JFK, RFK, Marilyn, Sam Giancana, the mafia, the FBI, the Senate committee that was doing the inquiry into JFK's death. All sorts of things can be better understood by understanding just that one paragraph of information. We'll continue with the article. Dorothy publicly challenged the authorities with tough questions. For instance, she wrote, if the woman described as Marilyn's housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was really a housekeeper, why was her bedroom such a mess? It was a small house and should have been easy to keep tidy. I just want to point you all to an entire episode that we did from Eunice Murray's perspective. It is called The Night Marilyn Monroe Died. And so that is a whole deep dive into that one woman and her experiences with Marilyn Monroe towards the end of Marilyn's life, the events of that night, and following. So you may be interested in that article as well. I'll link it all in the notes of this episode. Kilgallen also wanted to know, quote, why was Marilyn's door locked that night when she didn't usually lock it? If she were just trying to get to sleep and took the overdose of pills accidentally, why was the light on? Usually people sleep better in the dark. And she asked, quote, why did the first doctor to arrive on the scene have to call the second doctor before calling the police? Any doctor, even a psychiatrist, knows a dead person when he sees one, especially when rigor mortis has set in and there are marks of lividity on the surface of the face and body. Why the consultation? Why the big time gap in such a small town? Mrs. Murray gets worried at about 3 a.m. and it's almost 6 a.m. before the police get to the scene. Kilgallen wrote that, quote, "The real story hasn't been told, not by a long shot." Such bold reporting was not common in American journalism at that time. She could not have known that her own life would end under circumstances eerily similar to Marilyn's. March of 1963, so now we are 8 months before the assassination. Just to put it in perspective about the assassination, Lee and Marina have now met Michael and Ruth Payne, and in March they are making plans for the summer that they are going to go down to New Orleans. So that's what's happening in the Oswald household. March of 1963 brought Dorothy ill health as she was hospitalized for anemia. In her usual way, she appeared positive, saying, "Everything is going fine. I'm making my own blood again." However, her daily radio show lost supporters in Dorothy's absence, and in April was canceled. Dick Colmar sank into depression. Then, John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. Dorothy was devastated. Only a short time before, she had taken her young son, Kerry, on a tour of the White House one Saturday. To their surprise, President Kennedy invited them into the Oval Office and was extraordinarily kind. As a formidable crime reporter, Kilgallen immediately started asking tough questions of the authorities. She had a good contact within the Dallas Police Department, who gave her a copy of the original police log that chronicled the minute-by-minute activities of the department on the day of the assassination, as shown in the radio communications. This allowed her to report that the first reaction of Chief Jesse Curry to the shots in Dealey Plaza was, quote, "Get a man on top of the overpass and see what happened up there," end quote. Interesting. As if there was a frontal headshot, maybe. Kilgallen noted that he lied when he told reporters the next day that he initially thought the shots were fired from the Texas School Book Depository. Okay, so from the very beginning, she is spotting the anomalies, the things where things don't line up, and the people in charge are saying one thing and then editing very quickly to say something entirely the opposite. For those of you who haven't been to Dealey Plaza, just to be clear, the overpass is here, the school book depository is there, and he was right here. So you cannot perceive that a shot came from here and then say, "I thought the shot came from back there." It has to be one or the other because the car was between them. So very clear. In a lead story in the Journal American, Dorothy gutsily reported that Jack Ruby, policeman J.D. Tippit, and Bernard Weissman had a meeting at Ruby's Carousel Club 8 days before the JFK murder. Let's think about that again. She's noting that there is a meeting between Jack Ruby, who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, policeman J.D. Tippit, and Bernard Weissman. Bernard Weissman, but I just looked up who he was, and just so we all know, he was connected with the John Birch Society, with General Edwin Walker, who you remember had supposedly had an assassination attempt by Lee Harvey Oswald earlier that year. He's also connected to the Hunt group, so lots of connections with Bernard Weissman. Jack Ruby, J.D. Tippit, and this fellow Bernard Weissman had a meeting reportedly at Ruby's Carousel Club 8 days before the JFK murder. Weissman had signed the JFK wanted for treason ad in a Dallas paper on the morning of November 22nd. I'll put that up here so you can see it. That ad is very interesting. It was featured in the 6th Floor Museum when I went last fall. It was in the paper the morning that he was assassinated. Dorothy challenged the credibility of Howard Brennan, who supposedly gave police a description of the shooter. She wrote articles about how important witnesses had been intimidated by the Dallas police or the FBI. In the midst of her aggressive reportage on the Kennedy case, Dorothy met a man who was to intrigue her the last months of her life. He helped her on some of the JFK stories, but ultimately was to come under suspicion by amateur sleuths as having been involved in her death. Questions about him were raised by Lee Israel, who wrote the 1978 biography, Kilgallen. She never printed his name and referred to him only obliquely as, quote, the out-of-towner. But he is Ron Pataki, and he was interviewed by Midwest Today publisher Larry Jordan. Employed then as an entertainment writer for the Columbus Citizen Journal, Ron first met Dorothy in June 1964, so this would be 7 months after the Kennedy assassination, during a press junket for journalists covering the film industry. We were in Salzburg, Austria, on the set of The Sound of Music, and the bus had arrived at the set from the hotel, he recalls. She walked up to the door of the bus and kind of tripped, and I caught her by the elbow. She was on the outside of the bus. I looked at her and I said, "Well, hello," knowing instantly who it was. She said, "Thank you very much. And who are you?" flirtatiously. She giggled a lot. She was giggling the first 30 seconds we ever talked and kind of charming. And I said, "What are you doing after we get off the bus?" And she said, "Nothing." And we went and had drinks. The well-built 29-year-old Ron Pataki was quite a ladies' man. He had been engaged to the famous singer Anna Maria Alberghetti, squired Mia Farrow while staying at her mother Maureen O'Sullivan's New York apartment, and brags that he had already dated half of the females in Hollywood. So why his interest in Dorothy Kilgallen, who was old enough to be his mother? For all of her brashness in print, she was very poetic, Pataki reflects. She was a dyed-in-the-wool romanticist, to be sure, a very soft person. I never saw her angry. I don't think, other than strictly business, something like discussing the Jack Ruby thing, that Dorothy and I ever really had a serious conversation. I knew Dorothy better than anybody. We talked daily. If we missed a day, we were aware we missed a day. Let's put it that way. And it was not a love affair. Well, it was a love affair, but not a physical love affair. She was a sweet lady, my best friend in the whole world. Over the next 22 months, Ron and Dorothy rendezvoused often. Sometimes she'd come to Ohio to see him, and he even took her to meet his mother. He'd frequently go to New York. We'd shuck the rest of these phonies and go off and do our thing, Pataki explains. We made trips together. We went to Florence together. We went to London together. Yet Pataki steadfastly insists that he and Dorothy were platonic. He says we'd kiss hello on the cheek if I was coming into town, but there was no goodnight kiss when I dropped her off. And I dropped her off a lot of times, because it wasn't that kind of relationship. Never, not even close. I had my girlfriends. She knew about them. Ron avows they had nothing to hide. He says that while they did openly meet at hotels, we never, ever spent any time in a hotel room. But that's not what Mark Sinclair claimed. Mark was Dorothy's chief hairdresser and confidant. Though he later found her body, he was never questioned by the police and never spoke out publicly. His remarks are published here for the first time anywhere. He said that one Sunday night in February 1965, as he was doing Kilgallen's hair at her townhouse just before she left to do What's My Line, her married daughter Jill came by and confronted her mother. Jill, quote, was very angry, Sinclair alleged. She mentioned Ron Pataki by name and said, quote, that she was highly infuriated because her mother was going out with this man and sleeping with him all over town. And she said, "It's just too embarrassing to be seen in public with you." And after she left, Dorothy cried. And she said, quote, "I don't know why Jill wants to behave this way. She knows about her father and his indiscretions." She vowed, "I will never see Jill in public again." And she never did. There's a footnote. Our attempts to reach Jill and confirm the veracity of this story were unsuccessful. Back to the article. She had several places she could have gone with Pataki, Mark declared. One was my apartment, and there was interior designer Howard Rothberg's house. She could have gone to either. She had a key to mine and she had a key to his. And I told her, "Why are you going to a hotel?" And she said of Pataki, "He wants to." Ron admits he would stay at the Regency during his frequent trips to New York, and Dorothy would even pick up his room keys for him. There's a lot of things you're having to really swallow if you're thinking that their relationship is purely platonic. She's picking up keys, she's meeting him at hotels here, there, and everywhere, they're traveling together. But no, it was all just All just platonic. Midwest Today obtained a copy of a note Kilgallen had sent Pataki in which she romantically referred to, quote, our little spot on the 19th floor. Another time she sent him a newspaper clipping showing a picture of her in a meeting with two men. On stationery marked Dorothy Kilgallen, Kilgallen wrote, notice that they were the wrong guys to be at the Regency with. Where were you when I wanted you? Asked about this, Pataki told Midwest Today, I had a lot of mail from her that was written in a kind of intimate fashion. We'd flirt. She also apparently used him as a sounding board for some of her Kennedy stories. He explains, she would reach out if she respected you. She might well call you and say, I want to read you something. Tell me what you think of it, and make any suggestions. And then she'd read it and go from there. On September 25th, 1964, Kilgallen ran an interview with Aquila Clemens, one of the witnesses to the shooting of Officer Tippit, whom the Warren Commission never questioned. Clemens told Kilgallen that she saw two men running from the scene. Catch that? A woman who witnessed the shooting of Officer J.D. Tippit told Kilgallen directly she saw two men running from the scene, neither of whom fit Oswald's description. One of the biggest scoops of Kilgallen's career came when she obtained the 102-page transcript of Ruby's testimony to the Warren Commission. Readers were shocked at the hopelessly inept questioning of Ruby by Chief Justice Warren, and by Warren's failure to follow up on the leads Ruby was feeding him. Attorney Melvin Belly called Dorothy's scoop the ruin of the Warren Commission. Incidentally, John Daly, moderator of What's My Line, was married to Justice Warren's daughter, Virginia. So they're telling us another connection that's on that side of it, from the Warren Commission to the What's My Line producer or moderator. The FBI sent agents to Dorothy's townhouse to interrogate her, and an FBI memo reported that, quote, she stated that she was the only person who knew the identity of the source, and that, quote, she would rather die than reveal his identity. Ron Pataki says now that I helped her write the thing, but he adds, I was interested in the story only because of Dorothy, because she was in on it. On September 30th, 1964, Kilgallen wrote in the Journal American that the FBI, quote, might have been more profitably employed in probing the facts of the case rather than how I got them. That's good. She was tough. What a tough cookie. Kilgallen's next move was going to see one of Ruby's lawyers, Joe Tonnahill. Surprisingly, Ruby agreed to talk with her. Some have speculated that Ruby would not have told her anything important, but Tonnahill strongly disagrees. This interview with her was a very significant point in his, quote, classless life, Tonnahill asserts. He affirmed that Ruby, quote, cooperated with her in every way that he could and told her the truth as he understood it. It was just a very agreeable conversation between them. I just can't understand people doubting the sincerity of that interview. The attorney who observed the two talking said that, quote, I don't think there was any doubt about it. Jack was highly impressed with Dorothy Kilgallen. Of all the writers that were down there during the Ruby trial, about 400 from all over the world, she probably was the one that to him was the most significant. Kilgallen never published any information she obtained from her private talk with Jack Ruby, but Ron Pataki says that's because she was, quote, saving it for a book, end quote. She was under contract to Random House, Bennett Cerf's company, to produce a tome that was supposedly going to be a collection of stories about the famous murder trials she had covered. Instead, says Ron, it would have been on JFK, the entire assassination. That's what we were really working on. Of course, who better to write it? When she got into the JFK thing, as we all know, the world went crazy. But given her background, given the people she spoke with, don't you think the obvious thing would be that would be the book? Dorothy's last public reference to the JFK assassination appeared on September 3rd, 1965, when she challenged the authenticity of the famous Life magazine cover of Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly holding a rifle. She also chastised Marina Oswald for vouching for it. The incriminating photo has since been discredited by analysts who say Oswald's head was pasted onto someone else's body. If you go and look at the photo, you'll note that there are sharp shadows right around the chin area, And there is reasonable question as to whether or not the body matches Lee Harvey Oswald. There are things like, I believe, a bump on the wrist that was from a former injury. Photo analysts have looked at this thing, and there's reasonable people who question the validity of the backyard photo where he's showing off the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that allegedly was shot from the 6th floor depository toward Connolly and JFK. In October, Dorothy confided to What's My Line makeup man Carmen Gebbia that she was, quote, all excited about going to New Orleans to meet a source whom she did not know but would recognize. She said it was all, quote, very cloak and daggerish and would yield details about the assassination. Gebbia, I might be saying that wrong, it might be Gebbia, told Lee Israel that Dorothy said to me several times, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to break this case. New Orleans had been a bubbling cauldron of suspicious characters, ranging from Lee Oswald to Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Clay Shaw, and mafioso Carlos Marcello. Yeah. There's a footnote here that we'll read. Dorothy's trip was more than a year before famed New Orleans DA Jim Garrison got interested in the JFK case and charged businessman Clay Shaw with being part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy. So she's a year ahead of that whole event. She's already zeroing in on New Orleans. During the Shaw trial, the DA attempted to connect Shaw to the CIA without success. Garrison's efforts devolved into farce. But in 1979, Richard Helms, former director of the CIA, gave sworn testimony in a civil deposition which confirmed Shaw's contact with the CIA. Through FOIA requests, it has been confirmed that Shaw had access to and clearance from the CIA for a top secret program. The relevance, if any, to the JFK murder is unknown. So she was picking up on things a full year before even the DA Jim Garrison was doing so. Mark Sinclair said that in October 1965, during the New York newspaper strike, Dorothy hired him to meet her in New Orleans. Mark explained, she didn't tell me why we were going. She just asked me, could I go with her? And I said yes. She told me how I was to travel, where I was to go, what I was to do. And I'd never been to New Orleans before, so I didn't know anything about it. We didn't even travel on the same plane together. I went directly to my hotel. We talked on the phone. And then I went over to her hotel and had dinner. And then I went back to mine. And the next morning I was supposed to go do her hair and makeup. And she called me at my hotel and she said, I want you to go to the airport. I've left a ticket for you. And I want you to go immediately back to New York and never tell anyone you came to New Orleans with me. And I said, okay. And I left. I did not do her hair. Somebody or something had apparently spooked Kilgallen. Her other hairdresser, Charles Simpson, recalls, she even told me of her own volition, I used to share things with you, but after I have found out now what I know, if the wrong people knew what I know, it could cost me my life. That's about the halfway point of this article. So we are going to leave it there, which is a wonderful, terrible cliffhanger, right, for all of us. And for this article, I am not reading ahead. So I am just as on the edge of the cliff with you as you feel right now. But that gives us a wonderful look at Dorothy Kilgallen. What a fascinating woman, adventuresome, gutsy, willing to do hard things, willing to step into cloak and daggery experiences in order to uncover the truth. What a mission she had. And of course, it's going to cost her her life in our next episode. But I hope you've enjoyed this one. I hope it's given you a good dose of Dorothy Kilgallen, and I will see you next time for the wrap-up of the Dorothy Kilgallen little mini-series. Have a great day.